Hey everyone, it's great to be here with you at this panel, which is titled Building Responsible Human-Centric AI Models. I'm here with Banu and Conor, and we're just going to get into it. We're going to start off with a very brief introductions to ourselves and our work, and then we're going to open up some questions amongst the panel. And then we're going to give a good maybe 10 or 15 minutes at the end where you can type in your responses, your questions, your chat in the platform, and we'll respond live here verbally in reply. So with that, let's get going. Maybe, Banu, if I can ask you to spend 2 or 3 minutes sharing with the audience a bit about yourself and the work you do.
Of course. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Banu Raghuraman, and I'm in the domain of product management. I've been in the software development space for a while, almost more than a decade, tried different roles. My primary focus has been in fintech. I have also been published as a co-author in Empathy and Leadership. Apart from that, I also had the opportunity to win the top 10 Women in SaaS Analytics casting call. Today, I'm going to be presenting a view with those experiences in mind, with my user experience background as well as empathy, and hoping to have a good chat today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Conor.
Hi, I'm Conor Jensen. I'm the Vice President of Data Science at Dataiku. A little bit about myself as a background. So I started in the analytics space. It was about 20 years ago as a weather forecaster in the Air Force here in the States. Did that for a few years before going back to school, studying mathematics. And then I ended up in the insurance space where I worked for nearly a decade, working a lot around catastrophe management and forecasting, leveraging some of that meteorology background, moving more towards climatology. And then help build some data science teams and platforms as that sort of came to the fore in the insurance industry. I was fortunate enough to serve on a panel with the National Academies of Science around challenges with urban flooding and how it's different than some of the other issues that we face from a catastrophe perspective. Really cool opportunity to work on like a sociological sort of meteorological and challenges there. Before moving over to tech, where now I've spent the last few years at data science platform companies, helping really now sort of my former peers in the data science management space, building out teams, building out models, and helping to drive the impact of those data science teams. Obviously, we provide the technology, but also trying to help with all the things around that of what it takes for a data science team to be successful and impactful in the right ways that the company is sort of trying to maximize what they're going for.
Great, thank you so much. Great to be on this panel with both of you. I'll introduce myself. I'm both speaking in the panel and trying to moderate to the best of my ability. My name is Domhnaill Hernon. I'm currently a Director of Innovation and Creativity at EY, or Ernst & Young, as it's known, and I founded and lead an initiative at EY called the Cognitive Human Enterprise. And a lot of the work we do is around bringing together and investing in massively interdisciplinary collaboration, investing in full spectrum diversity towards creating the most cognitively diverse teams and organizations you can imagine. And then really only then being able to think about how you solve the world's biggest challenges ahead, both from a human point of view and from an industrial point of view. So my background is I'm an aeronautical engineer by training. Came from that engineering background, spent a lot of time in my previous company at Bell Labs, which is the research division of Nokia, leading innovation and creativity initiatives. And a number of years ago, I got exposed to the artistic and creative community through my work, and my mind was blown by the totally different way that an artist sees the world, the way an artist thinks about humans really deeply, meaningfully, purposefully beyond the way we're typically trained in STEM. The way an artist thinks about the intersection of humanity and technology, the way artists kind of have this philosophical approach to their work and just their general aesthetic. And I couldn't believe with all of my education and all of my experience and working with some of the best universities in the world and best people in the world that I was totally blind to this really unique perspective and different way of thinking. And it started making me think a lot about my own education and how I'm hiring young people out of all these top universities and the deficit in their education with respect to really deeply a human-centric perspective. And I started thinking a lot about how big companies employ those of us from the STEM subjects to create value in the market and how we're being paid, at times a lot of money to do certain work a certain way, which also is kind of void of this human-centric approach. So a number of years ago, I made it my mission to bring that perspective of artists deep into business, deep into technology companies at scale. And I'm bringing that work to EY, and something I'm very excited about, to do that at that kind of scale. So a lot of my work is around cognitive diversity, new forms of collaboration, and really towards the purpose of this panel, that deeply human-centric approach to thinking about technology, emerging technology, and the influence that business and technology can have on society, both for the good, hopefully, but also can turn out to be harmful at times when you don't think through these things fully. So with that, as I said, great to be with both of you. I think this is going to be a fun conversation. We'll keep it pretty, free-flowing and organic, and at any stage, please come in with your own questions or comments. Let's open up with a question around a very hefty, heady topic of what is human-centric AI. And maybe, Conor, if you want to kick us off.
Sure. So the human-centric idea, to me, I think it has a couple of different facets. One, there's this AI in and of itself is sort of already a multi-layered sort of topic or I'd say multi-definitioned, right? Lots of different people think about AI very differently. But so to sort of like think about this from a human-centric perspective, to me, is very much a focus on really two core lenses. The first one is in the how are we building what we're building in a way that it is taking in as much sort of human knowledge and human interest as possible, right? So, that's it's a little bit of a counterpoint to sort of the pure machine learning perspective of just throw the data at it and let the data answer the questions, right? Data is not neutral, right? As much as we like to pretend that it is, data, especially data that is the result of prior human decision making, carries with it all of the biases, all of the decision making, all of the heuristics that went into that. And so when you think about that human-centric building perspective, the way that I try to describe it is that, to me, building data products. All right, well, I'll do my best to pick up. Not entirely sure where we lost it, but sort of to the first half, again, to sort of recap it very much. How are we taking data, the data that is available, to test human hypotheses and human heuristics of how people make decisions today? But flipping to the second half of sort of the human-centric for me is how are we building models so people can use them? And that I very much go back to being a weather forecaster. When I was in the Air Force, I was an enlisted weather forecaster. I didn't have a degree in meteorology. I hadn't studied it. Our job was to learn how to use the models and to use the rest of the data to make good decisions. And I, in theory, know enough math to go in and like disaggregate the underpinnings of weather models, maybe, right? Like weather models are about as sophisticated as it gets from a data science perspective. But I didn't need to do that to be a good forecaster. My job is to learn the output of the models, how to use the models, how to make good decisions about them, because you didn't just take the model blindly and turn that into a forecast, right? Because we know that the model has biases, that it has its own fallacies. And so we had to know the situations in which you could trust the model, in which you couldn't trust the model, when in this particular setup, the model was off in a certain way and you would adjust it. And so that to me, that is that second half of human-centric, is not just how are we building the models with human knowledge and human understanding in mind, but how are we building and teaching people to use the models in the ways that are most effective. And I think, this is a long answer, so I don't want, but the thing to me is that we sometimes fall into this trap of saying, oh, well, you can't use complex models. You have to sort of be simple for it to be explainable, which I fully disagree with, because again, back to that sort of like meteorology example, I didn't need to know the underpinnings of how the model worked to use it effectively, but I spent a lot of time learning the models and how to work with them. You don't have to know the math. You don't have to know, what the type of algorithm is. It a neural net or a CNN or like that doesn't matter. You do need to understand how the model works as best as possible. And so that's that second part of human-centric is that. Okay, sorry, that was a very long answer. It's a lot. It's a lot.
No, very good, perfect. And apologize to you and to the viewers. There was a technical glitch there in the middle of your answer. You were going great. But we got you back. So Banu, if you want to kind of just share your thoughts on that question around, what is human-centric AI?
Yeah, I think Conor covered a lot of the pieces that I agree with. And that's basically what we need to look at is how well can we adapt the technology to assist humans in evolving better, becoming a better version of themselves as well. And I think with the recent news pieces that we see, we're always seeing data being misused. We're always seeing systems set up in a way to be misused by humans or even misused by the people who built them. So I think one other perspective that I would like to add to Conor's point is also about how we are building and how our business is actually using this information for their profit or for their own growth. Are they using it in an ethical way? Are they using it in the right way to promote humanity forward, rather than taking us a few steps back and perhaps giving rise to a Terminator-like situation, right? So that's the one other perspective that I wanted to add. Is how do we actually use that information to go forward as well?
Great, yeah, and I agree with both of you. I can maybe add a perspective maybe from a different angle. So I mentioned in my introduction, I come from an engineering, the physical sciences background, and it was aeronautical engineering, so airplane design and aerodynamics was my speciality. So I always draw the analogy in the difference between sometimes the physical sciences and the computer sciences in this way. What I see happen a lot today through data, algorithms, bias, all these major issues of our time, I kind of feel like there might be something missing from the educational point of view. So to give an example what I mean, when I was learning to design airplane wings, or when colleagues were learning to design bridges, I had to design in a safety factor. So in other words, the wing had to carry a certain load that was X times bigger than the possible biggest load you could imagine. And if the load was determined to go bigger than that, the airplane couldn't fly. This is why when there's bad weather in Chicago, Conor, as you know very well, the planes are grounded, right? I mean, because we have these safety thresholds and limits, and we have these safety factors in our designs, very carefully thought through. We put 300 plus people on an airplane, we do it in the safest possible way for those humans. It's a bunch of robots in the plane. Maybe we don't have the same safety factors, but it's human beings, so we must have it. So something that I get a little bit frustrated about coming from that physical sciences background with that kind of safety factor idea in mind is when algorithms get pushed out into the world without any concept of, we'll call it human safety for lack of a better word. And what I find happens is people in the data sciences, the computer sciences, the machine learning, generally, I'm painting a very broad stroke, but people generally seem to think that, it's only an algorithm. It won't really do any harm. It's a bit of data that came from there, but the algorithm will make sense of the data. And sure, what harm would an algorithm do? This is kind of like the notion that I get, or let's move fast and break things, this kind of complete and utter nonsense concept that drives me crazy. So when I think about human-centric AI, I think that sometimes we, or the folks that develop these technologies, forget about the fact that in the very end of the output of what this data and algorithms do is a human being that has to interface with it somehow. There's human beings that are being affected by it in their daily lives, sometimes in trivial ways, sometimes in really profound personal human ways that can lead to disaster. And then there's people that are creating these that aren't just thinking through the end chain, like what's the total journey of this from data to algorithm to human? What is the effect of this? And I'm not saying it's easy to think through the harm that can be caused to society with any technology. It's very difficult, but what I'm saying is at least the question should be asked. So that's kind of one perspective I have on when I think about human-centric AI. And I just use that analogy to the physical sciences because it's my background, and it kind of is an interesting, different way of thinking about how technology should be thrown out to the world.
Yeah, that's an interesting. It's really interesting because one of the things that I've often thought about in terms of when we think about designing models is thinking about who's going to consume the model directly, but from a sort of like, how is the decision going to be made in the future? And I often sort of have split this into is a human-based decision with the model or a computer-based decision, because that changes the sort of like the change management and how we want to roll it out. Because on the one hand, in terms of the development aspect and pushing things out into production, if it's computer implemented, it's a lot easier, right? So think about that of updating a recommendation algorithm on Amazon or something like that. Like, you know, the computer, the program is going to make the decision to display the product or to recommend the group or anything like that. And if I want to push a new version of the code, swap it out, hit it, and then that model is live. And so from a sort of purely like software engineering perspective, then that's much easier for me to push things to production. But I think to your point, Domhnaill, there's a lot that then you have to think about, you know, what's the ramifications of that? What's the impact? And yeah, we do A/B testing or whatever, but it's typically more to be what makes this model more effective in, you know, driving some sort of profit maximization or something like that, not, you know, thinking about a broader impact, you know, is talking about human implemented models where it's, you know, someone who's making a decision today, an underwriter at a bank or something like that, that you're going to give them a new model that gives them more information to make a better decision in the future, as long as they understand how to use the model. That change management is much, much harder because now you're training, you know, 5 people or 10 people or 1,000 people how to use the model. And so the model has less impact from a sort of like data science perspective because it's being filtered now through humans, but also those humans serve as a layer to sort of humanize the impact, for lack of a better way to put it, right? And so, you know, I think that's an interesting perspective of that we're not good at for these sort of faster implemented ones, the go fast and break things approach. It's very easy to make the change, but we don't do as good a job of thinking about the secondary, the tertiary, the full impacts of that change, because it's easy. So like make the change, and then if it doesn't work, we'll make another change. But I think it's a very anti that physical engineering approach, where breaking things is a bad idea.
Yeah.
Bringing up the recommender systems, I actually was thinking of one other point is also, I think we're increasingly getting into a space about the data privacy and how much of the users are we monitoring. So people don't want to feel as though they're being looked at all the time or they're being watched all the time to get a good recommendation for them. So it's like, oh, you know, you're telling me that all these things would be good for me, but how long have you been watching me, you know, to get these suggestions? So there is that aspect of layer as well. It's almost like I want to know about you without letting you know that I am knowing about you. You know, that's sort of a circular logic that's coming in, which is also interesting when you mentioned about the recommender systems.
You know, Conor, you told a story earlier about, you know, you don't need to understand the deep math and physics behind the weather models, which are extremely complex, but there's a certain kind of human logic that you can apply to understand if something makes sense. And very quickly, it reminded me of an experience way back in my career where there's this tool called computational fluid dynamics where you can simulate fluid flows, very similar to, you know, weather projections. And I was working with a person who wasn't trained in that or anything, but was using the tool and was building a certain thing. He asked me to look at it, and I looked straight away, and I knew immediately there was something really wrong in the way he built the model, but it wasn't obvious to him. And I was able to zoom in and show him that, do you see the way there in that open space, the fluid is all moving this way, and then for no reason, it like hits a wall that doesn't exist and starts bouncing back that way? That's clearly not logically correct, right? But they had relied on the model. They assumed that once the model got doing its thing, that everything was correct, and they didn't even think to question and look into it and try and apply human logic to on top of the mathematics. So there's this humans times machines kind of element that I do a lot in my work to kind of show those examples of where the combination of both is extremely powerful. Either on their own, maybe you can do more.
There's an anecdote that I often use as an example of where these sort of computer systems go wrong. Similarly was, a number of years ago, we'd had, my wife had I think our 3rd child, and I bought a car seat. And then like the next week I was on Amazon and it said, people who bought this also bought this. And it was like a list of other car seats. And I was like, I have a car seat. Why would you like assume that a week later, now I'm going to buy another car seat? And it was that exact same sort of like, just because I looked at a bunch of car seats doesn't mean that I want to buy 10 car seats like that. Yeah, I don't have 10 cars. And that's where we just, there's no human logic in what's going on there. It's just a computer throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks.
That's kind of, I laugh at times with people in a kind of in a friendly way, but I laugh when people say to me about AI taking over humans and being more creative than humans. I find it so amusing in a way, because just to your point, we can't even do these basic things with the algorithms. So next question, I'll throw over to Banu. So how do we build in the human element? And I know that you're very passionate about the empathy side of technology and this technology.
Yeah, for sure. It is actually something that I question myself daily, right? As we're building solutions for these systems, how do we make them better? How do we make them more sticky for the user as well? So there is the business component whereby you want to make sure that the business is profitable, but at the same time, delivering value for the customer. And then there's the customer side of things where we want to make sure that we are bridging a pain, where we're covering a need that they're looking for. So those are the two aspects that I would specifically look at and make sure that they're brought together. And in that ecosystem, we also have other considerations around the ethical aspects, the privacy aspects, the security aspects. But in general, you know, when we start looking at certain customer journeys, I think we kind of covered that in the last conversation. I think, Domhnaill, you mentioned that where in the customer journey is this person, and how do we account for some of the emotions that they go through in that journey and that process? And not just looking at, you know, what is meeting the eye, but also looking at something that's happening behind the scenes. There's something that product managers use called the empathy map, which is essentially, you know, we're talking to them, we're getting this feedback about, hey, you know, what do you think about this? But then we're basically categorizing their feedback in different aspects and looking at what is it that I see them doing? What do I see them, or what do I hear them saying? What do you think they're thinking? And what do they think they actually do? So observing them in these different quadrants and understanding how they're completely interacting with this system gives us a lot of data that we can then use to parse and synthesize and put that into the system. And I think, Conor, you mentioned about the A/B testing aspect. And yes, the fail fast mechanism doesn't necessarily work in every industry. I do agree that. But in terms of like software development and getting the designs out there, if you know quickly what is not really working for the client or what is not really working, like in this case, we were talking about the car seats. It's a classic example. You know, why would I be buying multiples of the same product when you know, at a time, humans are probably giving birth to one child? You know, that's probably, you know, statistically more often than having kids in multiples. And how often is that happening? So understanding some of these basic aspects will really help us. But bringing the human into the conversation is what's most important. And to Conor's point as well earlier, understanding what kind of biases are we bringing into that whole conversation will really help, in my opinion, to build a better solution and bring in that human voice in there.
Great. And Conor, I know you've touched on some elements of this, but I think, you know, if you want to kind of peel away a layer of the onion even farther and talk about how do we build in that human element?
Yeah, no, so the way that I kind of like to think about this best, and I'll analogize to the film industry. So I remember reading a book a number of years ago around how Pixar develops movies, right? And it's all about a story, and it's all about sort of like the story is king, but when they pick a new setting, a new project to work on, they would do, I think that, I forget the exact term now, but it was sort of like a research vacation. And they would take the whole team that was going to be, or the core team that was going to be working on this model, and they'd go immerse themselves in whatever that was, right? So, you know, when they were doing Finding Nemo, they all went and spent like 3 weeks scuba diving and at an aquarium and things like that. Or when they were working on Coco, they all went to Day of the Dead festivals and things like that. And so it's that idea of sort of, if you want to build something that fits where you're working, you need to actually go and observe and live in that system. And so we don't always do a good job of that from the AI product perspective. We're just sort of like, okay, like tell us how you make decisions today and like show us the data, and then we'll go off in our corner and build the models, rather than sitting down with that team that does this today and just sitting there for a week and saying like, all right, like let me watch you make this decision 100 times, or going to that customer and like seeing the focus groups, watching the people do it. You know, how are you shopping on this site, or how are you constructing, you know, this design that you're doing? And we don't build in that time to sort of like understand what is enough, because you can't really you can't understand how you're going to change a system unless you understand how the system actually works today. And that's the sort of key part to me, is just taking that time at the beginning to understand what's the decision that's being made today, what's the process that's happening today, not just have somebody describe it for you or show you a flow chart, but like go sit down. Go sit at the desk next to the person that you're building a tool for and watch them do their job for a week, right? An example of a project that my team was working on automating recommendations for support engineers on what sort of information to use. And honestly, we didn't do as good a job. The more time we spent with the engineers who were sort of doing this work, the more we understood it, but we didn't do enough of that upfront to and of course, 2 years ago, I decided I'd go fly out to the customer and sit next to them for a week and literally sit next to it and watch them do that. It's a little harder today, or maybe we'll get back to being easier in the future, but that actual human interaction of observe the system and then figure out how we can best change the system. But I think a lot of times blindly is a strong word, but we are not taking the time to really understand the existing system and how humans are making these decisions today before we throw a model into the system to change it. And that's where sometimes, again, that testing, we just figure we'll just change it and see how it goes, and then we'll tweak it again to make it better, rather than investing more time up front.
Yeah, and I just ask the viewers, if you want to start throwing any questions into the chat, now is a good time. We're going to open it up in maybe 5-7 minutes or so. So, please feel free to do that. I can just respond maybe my own thoughts and maybe respond to some of the things that both of you were saying there. So, if I was to extend my analogy earlier, just as one observation, when I talk about building in the human element, for example, if we think about an issue of bias in the data and bias in the algorithms today and the effect that can have on people, the analogy would be, and I'm sorry, I know I'm beating a dead horse here, as the saying goes, but the analogy would be someone designing an airplane, like a white person in Western Europe or North America designing an airplane for the white person in North America and Western Europe, and there being one part of the plane that is perfectly safe in all conditions for that person, and there's another part of the plane that has no safety factors, where anyone that isn't that white person from that area could suffer dire consequences. And you would never, ever do that in the physical sciences. You would never build a bridge where this side of the bridge is perfectly safe for one type of person and this other part of the bridge is really hazardous for another. And that's something, again, to extend the analogy, but just as a comparison to the fact that there are other sciences, there are other ways of educating, there are other ways of building products. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, it involves a little bit more upfront thought. Yes, it involves more effort. Yes, changing things is difficult. You build a bridge, you can't swap it out again in a month, right? But so there's the good and the bad of the speed of software and that we need to consider, but I would just use that comparison. So the other thing I would share around the human element is, for me, personally, and this is something I brought to my work, and this has come out of my interactions with artists, I've started, I think human-centric is maybe a bit of a buzzy term at times, comes out of design thinking quite a lot, and it has a lot of value, but I think people call a thing human-centric and call it something empathy, and they're really just doing user testing, and they're kind of calling it this other thing to make it sound like it's something more than it is. And I kind of started thinking a lot through interactions with artists and the projects we delivered in our job around the human condition. So in other words, to try and abstract it up to a more fundamental level, what are the fundamentals about humanity through the evolution of a species over a couple of 100,000 years? What are the things that are baked into our genetics and our biology and our physiology and our psychology and you name it, every other ology you can imagine? And what are those things that make us innately, uniquely human? And then how has technology in the last 20 years or so kind of maybe moved us away from that at times, moved us towards that at other times? And how can we use that as a lens to think about, well, if I'm developing this algorithm or this data set or this whatever, this product, is that going to make my audience, my consumer, move away from their humanity, cause harm potentially? Is the move good or is the move bad? Or is it going to help kind of build in that humanity into it? So I think we need to go beyond the buzzwords and we need to go beyond the well-known frameworks that are well-known for a reason, like design thinking, empathy, and all that stuff. But people use it as a crutch, or people use it again in this superficial way without going deep enough to everything that both of you have said. There's this deeper level to humanity that I think this industry and these sciences have kind of forgotten a little bit about. And I look at it from a different perspective because of my upbringing and my education. And it gives me, working with artists, this other way of thinking about that human-centric aspect. So maybe what we can do is we can spend just a minute each or so talking about what are the challenges ahead. I think we've touched on them a little bit, but just very pointedly, if you can share that, and then I'll check out the questions in the background as both of you are answering, and we can see if we can address any of those. So maybe Banu, if you want to talk a little bit about the challenges ahead.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges that I see, just based on the news and the political landscape, is that the legal side of things hasn't really caught up as quickly as technology has. And I think that's where a lot of our issues perhaps will come about, because not everyone, not every human being really works in terms of their daily interactions through empathy or making sure that they're doing the right thing for the community, right? And often what happens is we tend to diagnose the problem after it has actually happened. And then we backtrack and kind of look at it, oh, you know, maybe we need to put in some sort of legislation in here to make sure that this doesn't happen again. But definitely some of these tests and the new breakthroughs that we're going to go through, we will need a good amount of insight and input from legal aspects, from the ethical aspects and things like that, to make sure that we are going down the right track. But I see that as one of the biggest areas that I feel concerned about personally.
Conor?
Yeah. So I completely agree around the sort of legal challenges, and that like there's not enough in the guardrails, and so like the who's deciding what to work on is not really being done in a, we'll say, societally constructive way. The other challenge that I really see is this growing gulf between the people who are building and the people who are consuming, and this almost like bifurcation of, and I think it goes, and especially from an education perspective, far deeper than just the human-centric AI sort of question of like this bifurcation of like, oh, either you're STEM or you're artsy, and like, you know, never the twain shall meet. And I think, Domhnaill, obviously you're very much trying, you know, in a place where you're trying to bring those back together. But, you know, I sort of watch people who just sort of throw their hands like, well, I'm not good at math, and I don't, you know, so I don't know this, any of this data science stuff because I'm not good at math. And like I with all the hubris of a mathematician, I say the math is the easy part in building models. The hard part is understanding how do people interact with it? How does the model work? What are the impacts? All of that. That's way, way harder than the actual doing the math. And again, I don't think you have to understand the math at its core to really understand the impacts, understand how to use it. But there's nobody's investing in trying to bridge that gap. And, you know, when you think about companies today, in general, don't invest in training their employees the way that happened in the past, where it's sort of like, no, you go to college to learn your job and then you come here and we pay you to do it. Companies aren't investing in apprenticeships and long programs and, you know, putting years of training into their employees, because that model of the return isn't always there, right? There's a little bit of a some of the ways we work and interact with our companies is a little broken today, right? And so nobody has the incentive necessarily to invest these sort of like, these are all long scale problems to solve. And so if you're trying to solve for, I need a job this year and you know, I don't have any loyalty to my employer has no loyalty to me, I'm not going to invest myself in learning what they're going to do, and they're not going to invest in me. And on the commercial side, you know, if all I care about is a quarterly return, as you know, the shareholders of the C-suite, these are all questions that, you know, require years of scaffolding, of investing in the company, of investing in people, and it's in some ways diametrically opposed to the constructs in which we, you know, maximize financial returns at companies.
Yeah, I agree completely. I'll share maybe just a couple of perspectives and then we'll see. And folks, please ask questions. There's one comment which was very positive, and thank you for that, but no questions. So I'm worried that our audience are all bots because we're getting no interaction. You know, one, just to share a personal story, I was managing a software development team a number of years ago in a previous role, and we were developing out a certain application, doesn't really matter what it was. And I kept on getting the weekly updates, and I was interacting with it and testing it, and very like within 30 seconds each time I would find what I would regard as major bugs on the way a human had to interact with it. And eventually, met with the team and had a really big long chat about it, and I discovered that they weren't really testing the application or testing their own product. They got into this mode of which a lot of product people do, whether it's software or hardware. They just think about the tech and they build the product, and they don't actually think about how they would feel as a user themselves to deploy it. So I was asking them, forget about the fact you're an employee, forget about the fact you're a software developer, forget about the fact that you're the one developing this for this reason. Just put yourself in your mind's eye, you're at home in the evening this evening with your family, you're interacting with this application, the way it is today. Would it frustrate the hell out of you? Would you continue using it? Or would you think, oh, this is great, this helps me a lot? And each of them said, oh, when you ask us to think about it that way, this is crap. This is really terrible. They admitted it themselves. And it kind of was like a revelation to them, but it was a revelation to me as well, that somehow they got into the mode of just doing and not questioning, and not questioning for the general consumer base, which is really bad idea, but not even questioning about themselves personally, which is an easy thing to do in a way. Maybe it's difficult, I don't know. But that was just one observation that I wanted to share. I think for me, when the question is challenges ahead in building responsible AI, I think there's a major deficit in the educational system globally, in the STEM subjects and maybe a lot of subjects. I won't say in the humanities. The deficit is around that human-centric aspect, and of course that's core to the humanities and the arts. But in the sciences, I think there's a really major deficit. I'm seeing changes. I'm seeing some universities at certain scales trying to change this more interdisciplinary interaction, everything. But the whole system is incentivized in a way that is going to kind of stall that progress. And then when people come out of the university, the whole market incentivizes companies and employees to work a certain way, to your point, Conor, that really disincentivize you putting in the hard work to do these things and develop these products the right way. So I think we can fix a lot of these problems if we start earlier in education. And I'm not even talking about third level. I'm talking about going back to whatever, middle school in the US and high school or whatever they're called around the rest of the world. And I think we need to start instilling this ethos and this way of thinking and this human-centric approach much earlier in people. And then no matter what science they do or no matter what craft they take or what their role is in life, they should always be thinking fundamentally, how can I try and do good for society? Wouldn't that be a lovely thing if we educated people that way? So if anyone wants to comment on that, and I'll just check out if there's any questions. Okay. Thinking about the viability of standard practices and/or regulatory frameworks for establishing a human-centric approach, is it worth making stark distinctions across industries like health, education, and finance? Anyone want to take that up?
I can start off with some thoughts. Yes, I do think that there needs to be some sort of an industry-related aspect as well, because there are some intricacies, especially when you think about health versus education, or there is a layer of commonality where you want to respect humanity, you want to respect the person behind the data, and so on and so forth, which can be your common basis. But apart from that, industry-specific data that's going in, or the way technology, I always tell people this example because often whenever you're running into some problem within the department or the team, people will be like, oh, let's just throw in a technology solution in there and that's going to solve all our problems. And at the same time, they might be looking at certain solutions and they'll go, oh, this is a bad solution. And I tell them, knife is a piece of technology. But if you put that in the hands of a murderer, he's going to kill people. But then if you put that in the hands of a chef, he's going to come up with really good cooked meals. So it's really about making sure that, the kind of restrictions that we put in the relevant industry make sense for that industry, apart from the basic aspect of humanity and respect that we all have to have for each other. So I think industry-specific regulations are useful. That's my take on it.
I think that there's also a place for some more sort of like general certifications as well, though. I think that, if you think to be an accountant, right? you have to pass your licensing exams. You have to be a CPA. To be an actuary, you have to be certified. To be an engineer, you have to be certified, right? There's a lot of history of professions that have certification processes to sort of be able to go out and practice that job. Often they came back to something where, I think the physical sciences, it's easy. To be a doctor, you have to be, or you have to be trained and you have to have passed your exams. To be a lawyer, but because we've said that, these are roles which are societally important and have impact on people's lives. I think data science is an area that, because it's new, it's come about in a phase of the world in which we don't have this sort of habit of creating certification exams. But honestly, like, if I have to get a license to be a carpenter, I think the impact that the average data scientist can have goes far beyond. Now, granted, like, I'm not going to build a house that's going to fall down on you, hopefully, as a data scientist. But the impact that we can have as data scientists is so broad that I do think that there is maybe a need for some basic. And then that's, often comes with those is if you do things, if you cause harm, you lose your ability to do this job, right? Lawyers can be disbarred, doctors can have their licenses revoked. I think that there is a world where, regardless of industry, data scientists could need to have certifications which include some of this human-centric stuff, some of the pieces that Domhnaill talking about. That was certainly the case when I was studying to be an actuary. It was exactly that, right? There was the math. You had to prove that you could do the math, obviously, but you also had a lot of exam around the ethical implications of what you did and the standards of practice to which you were held, which if you violated, you could lose your ability to perform that function.
Great. Okay. I know we've only got maybe a minute and a half left or so, we'll just address this one quickly. What are your thoughts on balancing between the needs and wants of individuals and the potential risks to wider society? And there's an example, surveillance by video doorbell. So just maybe 45 seconds each. If you can, Conor, we'll start with you.
So I personally often veer towards the societal good more than the individual good. The needs of the individuals, I like, it becomes quickly too segmented and quickly too individualized. And so it's very easy for one person to make a decision that harms others. And, I think we need to think far more proactively around sort of like what's the network effects of these things, and not just release things for people to make their own decisions about without understanding those impacts.
Yeah. Banu?
Yeah, I just want to give a flip side to that. So yes, societal good is important, but sometimes when I think of initiatives like the DEI initiatives, where diversity, equity, and inclusion and things like that, sometimes it's also good to look at the other side, whereby you want to look at some individual needs and some individual requirements. For example, when we look at witness protection programs, or somewhere where we're protecting someone's life specifically, again, we're looking at the greater society there too. But at the same time, we're looking at one person's view with empathy and making sure that they are covered in there too. So I would I agree with what Conor said, but I would also think about those little people or the minority that we may not have thought about in the original design process.
Yep, fair.
Okay, great. Yeah, and so maybe just my take on the both questions or answers are that you always need a balanced approach with everything in life, and there's no silver bullets to solve any of life's big problems. And with that, I'd like to thank both of you, Banu and Conor, for being part of this. I really enjoyed it. I hope our viewers got to enjoy it. Thank you for the questions at the end. We'll leave it at that and close out, and wish you all a very good day.
Awesome. Thanks, Domhnaill. Thanks,
Thank you so much. Bye. Thanks.